a South African candidate emerges for IMF managing director, Trevor Manuel. That's probable, possible. But what will we be inheriting? I mean, they tried, at least the greatest economist of our generation, maybe Joe Stiglitz, to get a new ideology, a post-Washington consensus. Stiglitz introduced in January 1998. A year and a half or so later, he was fired by James Wolfenson, the president, who was told by Larry Summers, U.S. Treasury Secretary, get rid of that guy if you want another 5-year term as World Bank president. So Stiglitz had to go, and so there was no real shift. I think we found a little shift in October 2008 when the world financial system melted. For about a year, the IMF, Dominique Strauss-Kahn comes from the Socialist Party, but they were a little bit more Keynesian, so they opened up, except for Africa. There were very few African countries allowed to be expansive and to take fiscal space, but most had to have standard austerity. South African exception. It was in 2008 told austerity, cut the wages, cut the government, privatize, but there was a little space, and South Africa ran a much bigger deficit. And so it's not a rule, but certainly the IMF didn't really commit itself to Keynesianism as we sort of thought it might with Strauss-Kahn in 2008. And we haven't really seen any change. Anybody would be welcome to contest this, but I think it's same old at the Bretton Woods institutions. How about the MDGs? Pretty much mainly rhetoric. How about the WTO, the Doha round, the agenda of new round of trade liberalization? By all accounts, dead. Pascal Lamy, the current WTO director, tried a little bit a few weeks ago, but I don't think there's much movement at the WTO. How about Monterey for sorting out a new financial architecture? That's been on the agenda since the 1980s third world debt crisis, the mid-90s emerging markets financial crisis, 98 especially, when many Asian leaders said we need to have exchange controls, and as China and India did, they protected their economies at that time, and Malaysia came in. And by 2002, there was a sense, okay, we do need an international financial architecture. But they didn't put one together, did they? To continue to liberalize, and huge bubbles of debt and financial speculation resulted. And the G20 then tackled it in Washington in 2008, and London and Pittsburgh in 2009, a little bit last year, but really the momentum to change world finance and get the huge crazy derivatives and currency speculation and all of the rest of it under control. Hasn't worked. How about geopolitics and world peace? I don't know, the Central Asia, Middle East, now North Africa, as tense as ever. UN Security Council reform, big push by South Africa, but all attempts so far failed. G8 aid promises broken, by all accounts, the huge promises made for Africa in Glen Eagles in 2005, not being delivered. And then the tragedy that concerns us here the most, Copenhagen and the follow-up in Cancun. This is what it looked like in the final day of December 18, 2009, of signing a backroom deal with Barack Obama, Jacob Zuma, South African president on the left, Lula from Brazil, Manmohan Singh from India, Wen Jiabao. But this Copenhagen Accord, without going into all of the critique, really was about business as usual, did not get binding emissions cuts, was celebrated in the backrooms by fossil fuel capital, heavy industry, the transport sector, over-consumers, people like me who fly around too much. So nothing much was done there. And one reason that US delegation is absolutely hardline. Just think of their main negotiator, State Department. I know in Ottawa you've maybe run into him once or twice, but when he said this sense of guilt or culpability or reparations on climate debt, that the North has polluted too much and has to pay some of the damage, I just categorically reject that. And some of you who do economics know that this is a hit on a foundational principle of polluter pays. If you make a mess, you've got to clean it up. Nope, not Todd Stern. And at the same time, what he was up to, we know from this WikiLeaks February 2010 expose was with Jonathan Pershing, his assistant, bribery, bullying, and Meles Zenawi from Ethiopia, African leader, EU responsible for the climate debate, introducing in mid-2009 climate debt demands, big U-turn. And the February 2010 WikiLeaks reports really show what all the pressure was. Most poignant, these guys, you probably saw them before Copenhagen. You remember the cabinet of the Maldives having a cabinet meeting in scuba gear underwater to dramatize the sinking islands? $50 million bribery. That was all it took to get them to U-turn and endorse the Copenhagen Accord. So these guys are brutal. In fact, they went to Ecuador and to Bolivia, and they took away aid already promised, climate-related aid, $3 million. The Bolivian, very cheeky guy called Pablo Salon, I know diplomats in the room may have disapproved, but he came back and he said, okay, you've taken $3 million, that hurts. But we will give you, Barack Obama, $3 million if you sign the Kyoto Protocol. It didn't work, but anyway, it was a nice slide. They don't want to do ecological debt properly. We'll come to the $100 billion fund, if you like, where some of the critique is emerging. Even though it's being widely understood, this is a group around Richard Norgaard at Berkeley, really trying to figure out, well, there is an ecological debt. There is excessive extraction in the third world and excessive pollution hitting the third world by the first world, and that has meant a wealth effect. That really does explain some of the underdevelopment Richard Norgaard and his colleagues have begun to measure. Instead of coming to grips with it, what does Washington want to do? This is a bit of an old and famous quote, but it captures, I think, the essence, which is Larry Summers, then the World Bank chief economist, in an internal memo that the Economist magazine reprinted. I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. Right? So this is about using markets to solve a market problem. If you've got an externality, you've got a pollution associated with a market transaction not properly incorporated, oh, well, we'll just solve that with the market. We'll have some kind of trading, like a carbon trading. We'll come back to the logic and the results. And after all, as Summers says, I've always thought underpopulated countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted. So this is a real memo. He didn't really say sorry, he said I was being ironic, but I think it's extreme, but it still captures the essence of that neoliberal mindset. Anything can be commodified, and to hell with poor people and people who are being dumped on, they don't really matter. Africa is being polluted on. I'll just show you a few slides of some empirical bits and pieces. This is from southern Africa. Temperature rises above 1% already. You can see that if you fly from Joburg to Nairobi, the Kilimanjaro pops up and that little bit of glacier gets smaller and smaller. It's now just down to a tiny sliver. African crop net revenues could fall by as much as 90% by the end of the century. Small-scale farmers taking the hit, according to Pachari, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Director. And this is where some of the most recent measurements that come from a team around Samson at McGill have discovered lots of variability in especially droughts, flooding, and extreme weather events. So we've been seeing sort of extremes all over the world recently. In Pakistan last year, $50 billion of damage. So Africa gets hit. I'll come back to that. Who bears, although Zambia is up there because over 50 years there was quite a lot of emissions associated with copper mining. And South Africa really, I think the more recent data would show South Africa a little bit more red. But look, Canada is pretty much up there as Russia, per capita. This is where the greenhouse gases have been coming from, right? So you all are right at the extreme red. And Africa, who we're going to show, takes the brunt of the hits along with some of the Andes and the Himalayas, not responsible, right? Small island states underwater, you don't see them in the red. They're very green, but they're the victims. Here in North Africa, the Horn, West Africa, Central Africa, where you see white, it's not that it's not going to be hit, it's just that there aren't that many people per capita, so they left that white. Okay, so extreme events like flooding and other extreme droughts. In 2015, 20 countries, according to a brand new Center for Global Development report, will be Africa's, about 20 countries, Africa about 10 of them, Djibouti, Kenya, Somalia, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Madagascar, Zambia, Zimbabwe, as the kind of key victims along with China, the Philippines, Bangladesh going underwater. So extreme weather events and flooding. So what do we do? To solve the crisis, the mainstream opinion has been, maybe Al Gore best represents it, identifying we need to bring the emissions down. We saw the film, bring the cap down and slowly ratchet down the amount of emissions each year to the point where science demands it to be, a point that societies and nature can survive. And the technique is emissions trading. This is a technique that Canadian and US economists have been developing for more than 30 years. In the United States, the Clean Air Act was amended to allow for some sulfur trading for pollution controls to stop acid rain. There's quite a good debate about what the impact is and whether the command and control in Europe that was put on sulfur dioxide was more effective. I think it apparently was, and what the impact of especially the sulfur dioxide markets in allowing dirty industries in low-income areas of color, major debate in the environmental justice, anti-racist movement. But the main point I think I've got to make is that Al Gore, in arguing that the European Union has adopted this US innovation, emissions trading, and making it work effectively there, is just not looking at the data, and I'll come back in a second. This, unfortunately, is such active faith by world elites that in Cancun, after that disaster of Copenhagen, unfortunately, they've reified the markets again. And that's really, in a way, not just sort of bringing the UNFCCC back into sort of operational mode after it was so badly broken, but doing so by reviving faith. I'll mention one guy in particular who loves charismatic species and wants to make them part of the market, Robert Zoellick. But let me just develop a little bit more. The markets are a disaster. Look at them crashing all over the place. Since they started, the big one, the European Union's emission trading scheme, was up to 37 euros per ton of carbon, and then down to 20, and then sort of crashing all over. And then before the Copenhagen disappointment, because they couldn't pull a big global carbon market together, they got it up to, again, about 35, and then it crashed down to about 8.5. And it's been in this sort of range of 12 to about 16 cents. So that's not very high. It's not enough to do substitution of dirty industry with renewables, for example. And it's basically too low a market and too ineffectual and too chaotic. In fact, it's so chaotic that they had to close it about 2 months ago because hackers had gone into the Austrian government and a few other governments and stolen the certified emissions reductions as kind of virtual credits, and stolen, we're going to resell them. There's about 30 million euros. They had to shut the whole damn thing. I mean, this is a market that is doing about $120 billion a year of transactions. So it's an amazing problem. They couldn't have security, and so fictional, this commodity, the emissions trading credit, they had to actually close the markets. They've had other theft and other major scandals and problems, and the verifiers have been suspended from the UN, and lots of scammings occurred. There was a problem with refrigeration pollutants that were being created in order in China to get these credits. So this is quite a disaster. It doesn't really look very effective to me. We do have a South African who's very gung-ho, and Martinez van Schalkwyk, the Minister of Tourism, who was Environment and Tourism, was actually nearly the UNFCCC secretary. He was just barely came in second, but that's a sort of sense of a global, all-encompassing carbon market that the mainstream has been searching for. And the way it would work, if you want to stop this northern industrial pollution, you don't have to, because you can just let them keep polluting, but offset it with some clean energy investments and some sequestration, pulling down the carbon from the air. So that sense of an equivalence in a ton of carbon up there in the north can be offset by sucking it into the trees of the south. But there are some big problems. Here's one of the sites that's contested in Mount Elgon on the border of Uganda and Kenya, which is the site of Dutch investments in a big natural park to get reforestation. The problem is that the local people who've lived there for generations have been unwilling to accept that their land, which they need for cropping, will now just be a protected reserve. And so they're contesting that. It's been quite violent and difficult. And it's part of the general enclosure process associated with commodifying trees and forests. How about another crucial source of CDM, clean development mechanism applications? Oil companies in the Niger Delta that say, if you give us some money, we'll stop flaring. That is the gas flaring from this ghastly complex in the Niger Delta, where the activists, the communities, Ken Saro-Wiwa was starting out this amazing nonviolent movement, women taking over and blocking Chevron and Shell, and then the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, guerrilla movements, and lots of activism and lots of quite effective resistance.